Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Conversations on Groong episode. Today, our goal is to explore current developments in the world, how U.S. foreign policy under Trump and his new cabinet might act or react, how U.S. foreign policy might evolve, and what US-Armenia relations might look like. We have with us James W. Carden, a former advisor to the U.S.-Russia Bilateral Presidential Commission at the State Department, and Dr. Pietro Shakarian, a historian with expertise on Russia and the Soviet Union.
This will be a very interesting show, folks, so stay tuned. But first, thank you for following us. We're always happy to earn your support. We can never say thank you enough, and you can continue to support us through Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee, and you can find more information about this on our website, podcasts.groong.org/donate. Please become a sustaining member if you can, because that will help us plan our activities better. And we know that not everyone can support us financially, so you can still do great benefit to us by ensuring that you're subscribed, liking and sharing our content, most of all commenting. And I want to emphasize that we have a Substack page, which is groong.substack.com. So please make sure that you're also subscribed to that. We're going to focus on Substack much more in the future. Thank you, and on with the show.
James Carden, Dr. Shakarian, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Asbed, it's wonderful to be here. It's fantastic being on your show as usual. And James, it's great having you on and joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Welcome to the show, gentlemen. Let's just jump right to it. Already in the first month in office, the new Trump administration has begun changing the federal government with a bulldozer, or I guess maybe a chainsaw. I'm not sure nowadays. Trump has let Elon Musk and his Doge loose on various government divisions. First among the victims was USAID, and thousands are being laid off, and the NGO sectors in many countries are affected. Armenia is one such place. Truly, like, all the NGO folks are going door to door, with their hats in hand. So, James, where do you see USAID's future heading, and this whole situation? How is it going to develop?
Well, I don't see much hope for that agency right now, with the way that politics are going in the United States, I don't really see much of a opposition forming. The Democrats are in complete disarray. I think it's very possible that we're going to see 12 years in total of Republican rule from the White House, 4 with Trump, 8 with Vance. If that is the case, USAID is dead and buried, and it will have to take a transformative Democratic president in a decade's time to revitalize it, if that's at all possible. I think that the larger question of this Doge project is interesting, because on the one hand, you have agencies such as USAID, which are very deserving of getting the chainsaw. But, on the other hand, they aren't really doing this in a manner that is either dignified or fair to the workers in the federal government. So while on the one hand, I think we are probably all 4 of us in agreement about USAID, the other day I heard that, they were taking the chainsaw to the National Park Service, and they are cutting people with expertise at NIH and at HHS, and that seems to me to be kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So we'll have to wait and see what happens. But I think that as with anything with Donald Trump, it's a very mixed bag. Some things are worth applauding, like his efforts to bring peace to Ukraine, and others not so much. So we'll have to see. It's still very early days, though it doesn't feel like it. This has been probably, the founding fathers talked about energy in the executive. This has been quite a month, and probably a historic one, in good ways and bad. And so defer to Pietro. I'd like to get his opinion on it.
Like you said, they have actually, I'm sorry, Pietro, they have actually acted as a very blunt instrument. They, I think, fired a number of the nuclear facilities workers and also some people who were working in the biolabs or something about the avian flu. They've had to rehire those folks. A lot of mistakes made, and I completely concur. They have gone about it in a very undignified way, even if the goals are, we agree on.
Yeah. So, I mean, basically, I mean, just to kind of, kind of add to what Carden said, absolutely. I mean, unfortunately, I mean, with anything else with Trump, you're going to see a mix of kind of, with the wild, the crazy, with something quite reasonable and something that actually is really in the United States national interest, right? So, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the impact I can say for USAID, if we look at like Armenia, we're already seeing kind of how it's hitting the NGO sector. Like as Hovik was like alluding, we have people like Daniel Ioannisian, who's like now begging for donations. I mean, you see all of a sudden these what I call.
Funny thing is that he thinks that people will actually donate,
Well, absolutely, absolutely.
to their great
He thinks
cause.
yeah, I mean, he thinks he's giving a great service to Armenia, and even they had actually a great episode recently of Armed Comedy where they were kind of satirizing about Azatutun, which actually that's Radio Free Europe's Armenia service, how it was basically dying effectively, and so yeah, we're seeing the impact of that, and I think it's quite good because the forces that have enabled this catastrophe that this nightmare Armenia has been living in since 2018. I mean, basically, as I say, I mean, Pashinyan, he's not only not only somebody who betrayed the Artsakh Armenians, not only somebody who betrayed and is betraying the Armenian people, but he's somebody who really is like a foreign agent. I mean, he's not acting in the Armenian interests at all. So this nightmare we've been living in it since, I mean, as Armenians and even Armenians in the diaspora, Armenians internationally, this nightmare we've been living in since 2018, and especially since 2020 and 2023, we're seeing some hope, some rays of hope that it could be possibly ending. So that's why, I mean, I agree completely with James and everything he said that, again, this is Trump, takes a chainsaw to something and a lot of, I guess you can say, a lot of stuff happens as a result of that. There's some good, there's some bad, but in terms of how this is impacting Armenia and also Ukraine too, you have to think like 90%, I think it was, of Ukraine's media was funded by basically the United States. So yeah, I mean, we're seeing the immediate impact of this already.
Oh, well, I got a laugh
So
the other day when I saw a headline from the Kiev Post, which basically said that. They basically admitted it. They said aid funding, is being cut and it's going to decimate Ukrainian independent media. And I thought, wow.
Well, that's actually a contradiction in terms, independent media, because
independent,
how are they, if they're getting
independent.
funds from the American, yeah, they're getting funds from the American government, how are they truly independent? I mean,
So let me ask another question. I mean, look, Trump is not really interested in making sure it's a fair playing field in Armenia, right? To the Trump administration, what is the value in cutting USAID? Because doesn't, in the end, all of this sort of lead to regime change and regime change that is favorable to the United States? Why? So maybe there are some bad aspects of it, but logically thinking, wouldn't Trump still be interested in changing regimes all around the world to benefit the United States?
I just want, well, you go in, James, on this one.
I was just going to say, I think that the lesson and the correct lesson that Trump and the people around him have drawn with regard to these regime change operations is that in the end that they don't benefit the United States. They're counterproductive. So I think, that's one of the things that he's doing that I think we can, get behind. Aid has, for a very long time, acted as a tool with which U.S. intelligence agencies manipulate the internal workings of other countries, as Armenians know all too well. As look at what's going on to the north in Georgia. I mean, my goodness. So the people around Trump understand that a lot of these terrible things that have unfolded over the past decade or more, such as Maidan, for instance, probably wouldn't have happened or happened as quickly without the intervention of places like USAID.
The other thing also I want to add to this, the other point that's really quite important to underscore is the fact that the United States itself, there are a lot of parts of the United States, and I can speak to this. I mean, if you go to Cleveland, Ohio, and you go to some of the rougher neighborhoods of Cleveland, Ohio, you can see it. There are a lot of places in America that need aid, that need funding, that need support. By the way, when everybody is throwing around this, the name USAID, right? It sounds so altruistic. It sounds so nice and fluffy and so so kind and so generous, But in truth, it's very sinister because, as James says, this was an instrument primarily, mostly. I mean, I'm not saying that there were some good aspects. We can say maybe to USAID of U.S. Money going to help some legitimately good projects, but overall, they went toward regime change, and the amount of money spent. I mean, when you look at just like $1 million here, $1 billion there, and you think, that money can be used in America. Like there are neighborhoods in Cleveland, Ohio. There's one neighborhood where the median income is $8,000 a year in the richest country in the world. And not only in Cleveland, you have that in Philadelphia, you got that in San Francisco, you got that in Los Angeles. Asbed can vouch for that. You got that in New York. You got that all over the country, Chicago.
I was going to say, come to Los Angeles and see the homeless problems that we have here, and the veterans who have various issues and things like that. But as far as U.S. aid goes, Pietro, Hovik made a policy for our show not to say U.S. aid, and that we should call it USAID. To highlight the fact that it's really not
the least
aid,
we
it's
can do.
I absolutely agree with
AID,
this.
international development, and that development should be quoted, actually.
That's right. And,
But
one of the things that we should keep in mind is that, elections, we're finally seeing this in the United States, that elections have some consequences. For the past 30 years, you would have an election, one party would take over or another, nothing would change. That's a big difference with this election. America first means America first. USAID was $60 billion a year. And as Pietro points out, we have tremendous challenges here at home. We have tremendous problems at the southern border. We have problems with opioid addictions and overdoses. We have natural
Fentanyl. We have
catastrophes,
fentanyl.
fentanyl and the natural catastrophes that have unfolded in Los Angeles, for instance. We don't need to be doing this, and the Trump administration knows it, and I think that they've done a good thing. But having said that, the first month has been a lot of low-hanging fruit. If they're really serious about putting America first, they need to tackle the $1.5 trillion budget of the defense and intelligence community that's combined.
that was exactly my point because I think that before USAID, all of these things were, regime change operations were still happening. They were just happening out of the CIA budget. Wouldn't some of these things still take place, except they would, be funded in a different way? So that was like maybe I'm being a little bit cynical and a disbeliever in all of these.
No, actually, I think you have a point there, Hovik. You're right to be cynical because, I mean, again, like James said, in the American context, I mean, Americans have been voting for 30 years in elections, and we haven't been seeing much change. I mean, like most famously, the first election I voted in was in 2008. I voted for Obama. I thought this is going to be when the wars end, man. I mean, I thought that the Iraq War, the catastrophe of Iraq, the atrocity of Iraq, that now we're going to move beyond this point in history. That just like how we learned from Vietnam, we're going to learn from Iraq. But we never learned from Iraq. What did Obama do? He got us into Syria. He got us into Libya, into Ukraine, actually for the first time, really, if we're talking about 2014. So in reality, like James says, I mean, you're right very much, Hovik, to be cynical about this. And really, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if, again, maybe they just go back to the old method of having CIA just do the, typical coups that have been so classically part of their trade that have been such a classic part of their trade for so many years. So I don't know. It's an interesting discussion.
I would say, Hovik, that no amount of cynicism is enough when you're discussing the United States government. So don't ever apologize for sounding cynical.
And especially Washington, D.C. politics, as James can testify. Washington, D.C., it's really, I mean, and actually it's interesting because people would say, well, they'd watch like the old picture from 1939 with James Stewart, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and they would say, well, it's always been like that. But I think actually it got worse, if that's possible. I mean, it got even more, the lobbyism got worse. The money, I mean, the big money has become much more influential. So yeah, I mean, the United States is due its own. I've been saying this for years. It's due its own glasnost and perestroika. It really needs, real reform, and maybe we're seeing the beginning of it. Who knows? I mean, yeah.
Yeah. So wherever we look at trouble spots around the world, we see that Trump is engaging in his signature transactional style. In Gaza, he wants to own it and develop it into a French-style Riviera. In Ukraine, he wants $500 billion of mineral rights, although to us it sounds more like classic colonialism, to be honest, a resource grab in a country that was the battleground of a proxy war between much larger powers. He wants tariffs to equalize bilateral trade deficits with every country, friend or foe. I mean, Canada or, whatever country. He wants Panama. He wants Greenland. Okay, Pietro, when it comes to foreign policy, um, cultural, historical relations, is a transactional style effective in international relations?
That's an important question, and we're going to see it demonstrated now, right? I mean, especially, oh, I don't know. The thing is that how do you interpret the multipolar world that we're in right now, right? You can interpret it one of two ways. Multipolarism built on the UN Charter on international law, right? So our friend Mr. Lukyanov, who is on your podcast, would certainly agree with that idea of multipolarism. But then there's also this like kind of this idea of like law of the jungle, like Greenland. If we want Greenland, we take Greenland, that kind of a thing. And so I mean, but on the other hand, it's going to be interesting to see where Trump goes because it's been so wild and so unpredictable. I don't even know how this is all going to end up, to be quite honest. I can say this, though, that you can't to answer your question directly, you can't really approach international politics like a business deal because there's so much more nuance in there, right? And he's learning that now with Ukraine. Ukraine is much more complicated than, let's say, a real estate deal in I don't know, Queens.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And so he's learning the hard way. It's quite complex. And actually with US-Russian relations, if we look at Riyadh, if we look at what just happened today with Istanbul, I mean, the United States approach should probably be to think about restoring relations with Russia first, and then using that, then going from there toward a peace settlement in Ukraine. Right. So they can't combine both in the same package. They're trying to, it seems like the Trump administration is trying to combine both in the same package and kind of, run it through. But it's a little bit more complicated than that, to be honest with you, I think.
At least it has the idea that it needs to completely redo its relationship, a reset in its relationship with Russia. In a sense, like the big rocks, little rocks theory, where you deal with the big priorities first and then the small ones start settling around it. But you're right that if it's trying to fit everything into one package, it might not work properly. So, a quick question to James on this one. How will US foreign policy need to adapt to Trump's transactional, no free lunch style of foreign policy?
I think it remains to be seen. I mean, you're right about the colonial overtones coming from the administration. And I think what we're seeing now is a transition in the United States from the idea of this fictional rules-based international order to this kind of colonial throwback. I would say that while I dislike it, I don't like the idea that Trump is threatening Panama or Greenland. It's more honest. It's what it is. And, it's Trump's response to reality. So the Biden administration and the Obama administration couldn't face reality, and so they hid behind the kind of happy talk about there being an international rules-based order. This kind of crypto-colonial approach is the Trump administration's, I think, first attempt at facing the multipolar world. And so, in that, at the very least, even if you don't like it, and I don't, you know, at least they realize that that's what it is. The world has moved on. The unipolar moment is long dead. And what we are facing now are I believe, the emergence of kind of bloc politic. And that is very much behind the Greenland and Panama moves, right? Because it's not really it's a response to China. It's not a really, and it's completely a response to China and this idea that China is going to, become the peer competitor. So I don't know. I mean, again, as with everything with President Trump and his team, there are pluses and minuses. The plus is, in this case, is that it's more honest and it's a reflection of what's actually happening in the world. The minuses, of course, is that it makes us basically look very foolish and petty on the world stage. But we've had worse.
Yeah, and also, I mean, it's like if we look at like the Iraq War, and a lot of folks were saying correctly, I mean, that, look at one of the major overarching reasons for going into Iraq was the oil, right? There's also Israel. There are other reasons why, America went into Iraq. But at the time, Bush was dressing it up in these wonderful terms. It was about democracy, bringing democracy to Iraq, right? Even to the point that when Jacques Chirac and the French dissented on it, that there was such a furor that they had to rename French fries to freedom fries. And so, but anyway, with the case of the Iraq War, now if something like that were to happen today, Trump would just say, "We're going in for the oil," and it would just be very direct. They wouldn't try to like dress it up, like I mean. So this we saw actually really it goes back really to Clinton, with Clinton, Bush, Obama, Biden, all these guys. They were all about kind of like the rules-based order, this idea of democracy, human rights, that America is, the city on the hill, that we are the exceptional nation, that we should go in and we should, change. We can change any government in the world that we want. We're that,
I mean, you can argue that it's been a dog world in international geopolitics forever. It's just that one side has been dressing up its arguments in this whole democracy and human rights veneer, and now the sheen is off. Nobody's talking that language. They're just saying what they're going to do.
Yeah, well, at least we have international law. If we didn't have international law, then we'd really be in a dog-eat-dog world. It would really be. That's why Lavrov said, at least, we have that. At least we have something. We have some international institutions. We can criticize the UN. We can criticize, international bodies, but still, it's something.
The difference between Trump's approach and the Biden-Obama-Bush approach is that it cuts out a lot of the middle stuff, right? So under the old way of doing things, the US would have to create the conditions on the ground to make it appear as though our regime change project is welcome, is indeed reflective of the popular will in these countries. And that costs money. That costs a lot of money. And that's why you had USAID. That's why you have the National Endowment for Democracy and all these other places, right? Trump doesn't need that anymore because it's just going to be very straightforward. It's going to be kind of a American colonial throwback.
And also, you have to think about like the hard financial realities of some of these moves. I mean, like look at the American debt and the deficit. I mean, I mean, cutting that USAID and cutting that. I mean, still, there's still a lot more. There's still a lot of problems even after that. But and nevertheless, there is this idea that the budget is too big. We gotta trim it down, So yeah, you can see some logic with what they're doing.
Shall we look at some of the Trump cabinet appointments? Because now that Tulsi Gabbard, Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth, and others whom Trump nominated have all been confirmed, let's take a look at some of them. To be honest, I was skeptical that, I mean, RFK Jr., Tulsi Gabbard would get confirmed, but it seems like Trump got all that he wanted from this. So let's look at Hegseth. He came in with non-mainstream views on U.S. armed forces and the Pentagon, and he has even Trump has floated the idea of having the U.S. defense budget if China and Russia will agree to do the same. James, what is the impetus for this kind of talk? It seems revolutionary, and if it is serious, how likely is it to come to fruition in 4 years of time?
I don't know. I mean, it's impossible to say now because I would never have predicted what has unfolded over the past month to have occurred, right? So, to predict what's going to happen under a Trump administration is a fool's errand, but I'll run it anyway. I think, there's a realization that, there's a lot of bloat, there's a lot of waste, and I think that they're going to make an effort to get rid of some of that. Um, you know, it, Hegseth himself, I think, is not so important. And I'm not really sure how long he'll be on the scene. And no one really understands why he was appointed to this position, to which he's eminently unqualified in the first place. Um, but if Trump is as good as his word, and we'll see, then they are going to cut the Pentagon. They are going to cut the intelligence budget, and we are going to scale back because that's a key component of the America First promise. Um, Beyond that, I have no specific predictions. I mean, the one thing that they made a big deal about during the campaign and that they have followed through on is the DEI stuff. So there was a lot of talk about they would immediately eliminate these DEI offices and get rid of these people, and they have. And Tulsi Gabbard has been on the job for a week, and she's already fired 100 intelligence officers because they were in a they were using, a government chat room to basically, well, it was disgusting, but it was basically a
Yeah.
sex-based, thing. So she fired them right away. So they're pretty serious about this stuff. Um, so I guess we'll see what happens. Pietro?
Actually, Pietro, let me just ask you a question, and then you also respond to this one.
Okay.
But with regard to Trump's proposal to Russia and China, do you see them seriously considering it? And also, anything else you want to follow
Which
up with
proposal was this exactly?
on having the defense budgets?
That on that proposal, I think I think actually it could very well be a serious thing. I mean, I think Trump definitely sees certainly, and actually, frankly, for the Russians and the Chinese, I don't think they would mind it either. The idea is that, especially if we look at kind of, again, how maybe Fyodor Lukyanov, actually not maybe, how he would define the multipolar world order, it would be a multipolar world order that would envision not necessarily kind of a competition, among nations or kind of a dog eat dog kind of a situation, but to kind of, maximize cooperation to the benefit of all the people of these countries. So I can't imagine, Russia or China really being opposed to, cutting their defense budget if the U.S. agrees to it. If everybody agrees to it, then it's a wonderful thing. I mean, everybody can then maybe agree that, we don't need this, that we can focus more on the well-being of people. I mean, if we look at like China, I mean, for example, like the One Belt, One Road, I mean, of course, there's a lot of, criticism. People think this is like, China's trying to be colonial, but in reality, they're just, trying to kind of like enhance, certainly their own economic position, but also they're helping many other countries as well along the way. So yeah, I mean, not everybody would agree necessarily with that assessment if you talk to a China hawk, let's say. But I think that at the end of the day, sure, if Trump puts that proposal forward, and and the Russians even said, hey, we wouldn't mind certainly cutting our defense budget. China, the same way, they would feel that, hey, let's kind of come to the table and see what we can do. So, but the one thing I wanted to throw out there is the biggest potential challenge to this, as I see it, ironically, is the EU. Because when you look at the Eurocrats, when you look at Frau von der Leyen, when you look at Kaja Kallas, when you look at all these people, Michel, Borrell's no longer there, but I like to mention him anyway. But all these Eurocrats that you know, they might stand there yelling and screaming about supporting Ukraine, you know, with their blue backdrops and everything like that. But to me, it's utterly shameful, because look at the history of, like I said on this podcast many times in the past, look at the history of war in Europe. Look at the history of the wars of religion, the 100 Years' War, World War I, World War II. And yet you would think after all this, that Europe was ready to put war behind them. Certainly that was the idea. When you look at the original intent of the EU, when you look at post-war Europe, right? And now you look at the European elites, my God, they're gung-ho for war, to the point that they even are saying that peace in Ukraine is more dangerous than war. And imagine, we're talking about a war involving a nuclear armed Russia. So, I mean, it's like insane.
I think, I mean, it's good that Orwell is dead, but yeah, that's the most Orwellian thing I've heard this week.
He didn't know that he was writing a documentary.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. You know, as they say, truth is stranger than fiction, and we're seeing that unfold in real time. James, any thoughts on the Eurocrats?
Well, yeah, I can't help but wonder if should, you know, there be a deal reached between Trump and Putin to end this thing, if among the Russian elite there may be more of a willingness to come to terms with Washington. But I get the sense that there's going to be a real divide, a real permanent damage to the relations between the Russians and the Europeans. And it seems to me that once the Ukraine war is over, the big problem is not so much a détente between the United States and Russia. It's going to be between Russia and the Europeans. And it seems to me that that's being reflected right now, even in the different European responses to Trump's program. I'm just curious as to what the perception is in Russia with regard to that. Is there seems to me to, among some of the elite, to be a great deal of anger towards the Europeans.
Well, I'll put it to you this way. I mean, they're not really angry I mean, they're annoyed with the Europeans, right? To say that they're angry implies that, you know, Europe is doing something bad and that it's affecting us and that we need to, you know, kind of get back at them. But in truth, they look at them like, you know, like yapping dogs, these Euro elites. They look at them like yapping dogs. Like I even have a colleague at the university, right? And he has a German Shepherd, and he was with his wife walking the German Shepherd down the street in St. Petersburg. And there was a woman who was walking past them with 3 Chihuahuas, and they began barking like crazy at the German Shepherd. And my friend leaned over to his wife and he said, it's the 3 Baltic states right there, So, but the bottom line is I just want to say about this is that when you look at the Western European, when you look at the European politicians, the Eurocrats, the reality is that they don't know where to go. That they had developed kind of a dependency on the United States, in particular the Joe Biden White House. And now that whole world that they knew, that whole structure is falling out underneath their feet. We also have to understand too that these are elites. So these elites can be taken out by elections, by political shifts going on in these countries. So that's how I see it, and that's actually how really the Russians see it. They see it that these guys are really that they're yelling and screaming now, but in the end they're going to fall in line with Washington in some way. It might not happen immediately because you still see these current elites who are still very much under the influence of the Joe Biden administration. In some ways, I think Arthur Martirosyan said this on the most recent Groong podcast. He was talking about how, in fact, Trump is struggling. Actually, the US is also quite at loggerheads with the Europeans because they perceive them as like they perceive the Democrats in the United States, right? This is what Martirosyan was saying. So there is even this issue with between Trump and the Europeans. I mean, you could maybe summarize Trump's attitude toward the EU as being similar to Victoria Nuland's. You know, she used a not so diplomatic word to describe the EU in 2014, or she might have been in 2013, actually. And I can't say it on this program because we're a family-friendly program. So I can't. I mean, the FCC would get after me if I said that. But
we're not bound by the rules, but okay.
Well, but nevertheless, you get
yes.
you
But
get the
think
point.
of all the kids listening to this show. Come on.
I know.
So, in the interest of time, I do want to move forward and talk about another one of Trump's cabinet members, Gabbard. So, no Democrat voted for Gabbard, who is considered a turncoat by them. But in our opinion, I think she's an independent thinker, and she even met Assad years ago. Imagine that, having a discussion with your enemies and trying to sort of come to understand them. And she's been a skeptic when it comes to the intelligence community, co-writing a law to repeal Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, which enables the program of government surveillance, which she says is an overreach. She has also refused to condemn Edward Snowden as a traitor. But that was the thing, that during her hearing, she flipped on Section 702 and said she'd used it to support national security, which gives me a little bit of a, sort of, that was a bad taste in my mouth after having like sort of a good news about her, confirmation. So James, under Gabbard, how will the intelligence community change or be affected?
Well, I think in the first place, she's not going to be on board with regime change operations and starting regime change wars. That's been one of the things that she's been absolutely consistent on from the time she was a Democrat when she entered Congress to now. So those days are over. I think that my guess would be that there's going to be more of an emphasis on analysis and intelligence gathering, and less so on special operations. It also wouldn't surprise me, given what Trump has been up to, it wouldn't surprise me to see a kind of reorganization of the intelligence community, which I think is kind of long overdue. Um, Proposals to that end have been proposed by administrations going as far back as John F. Kennedy. His aide, the historian Arthur Schlesinger, who was a veteran of the precursor to the CIA, the OSS, proposed a reorganization in 1962 or so. You know, it's grown.
What are some of the key reforms that you think will be necessary for that?
I think ideally you would see a split between analysis and operations. And I think that, Schlesinger's idea was to move operations into the Pentagon and analysis into the State Department. I think that since 9/11, the intelligence community, has grown to massive, massive proportions. I'm not sure all of that's needed, probably isn't. So, I think a general kind of reorganization along those lines. We have 18 separate agencies that comprise the intelligence community. That seems like quite a lot. The DNI is supposed to coordinate all that work. I'm not sure how well it does that. So I think, they're going to really have to cut and ask some hard questions and really figure out what it means. What does this mean? Does intelligence mean analysis and gathering, or does it mean, special ops and all sorts of, off the books operations and assassinations and things of that nature? I hope it moves away from the latter and focuses on the former.
I want to throw out a question to James really quick. What do you make? I mean, this is kind of a little bit off this issue because that's very interesting. This intelligence, discussion. Will hopefully we can circle back to that. But I want to ask about how do you perceive the split between, or this kind of, I guess you could say that this really kind of dramatic rift between Trump and Zelensky, because that was a big issue recently in the news. How do you perceive that?
Well, he'll be here tomorrow. So Zelensky's flying to Washington. The thing with Trump, and one of the things that I think European leaders have been slow to come to understand, is that throwing insults out is the way of this. This is the way this man communicates, and you can insult him back, and he doesn't really care. So like all the talk, all the sniping, all the insults, it doesn't matter to him at all. He's like a professional comedian. It doesn't, he's interested in the bottom line. He's interested in the deal. So there's a lot of, there are a lot of stories about there's this tension, and I doubt that very much. I think Trump is going to basically push Zelensky in a corner and make him sign the paper, and he's going to get what he wants. And of course, Trump has repeatedly said over the past couple of weeks that, we're in Ukraine for $200 billion and we're not getting our money back. And, where's kind of the return on investment? Because he thinks like a real estate person. He thinks like, a businessman. So I think that, the focus of the meeting tomorrow, and probably to Zelensky's dismay, is going to revolve around mineral rights, and it's not really going to revolve around the military situation or the humanitarian situation in Ukraine.
Well, I wonder if this kind of rare earth deals that Trump, kind of pushed forward on Zelensky, I wonder if it was like he designed it to be such a terrible deal for Ukraine that it would almost be inevitably rejected by Zelensky, because Zelensky looks, I mean, he's just so terrible. And I think he's like in really many ways. I mean, this is also what most Russian analysts say, and I would tend to agree that Zelensky is one of the impediments to peace, really. I mean, he's been actually kind of like really egging on this war, I mean, to his own benefit.
Pietro, this is one reason why I was saying that this is kind of a colonial style grab of the resources in the Ukraine. But the interesting thing is that it's going to soon be obvious to even Trump that at least 50% of these minerals that he's talking about are in the east of Ukraine, where Putin is in control. How do you think that's going to go forward?
Well, no, what I think actually happened is I think actually Trump caught Zelensky in a lie, because Zelensky was trying to really kind of appeal to Trump. So he was trying to say, look, you know what, you should stay in Ukraine because we got rare earth, materials here, and there's reason to stay. And then now Trump is actually, taking him at his word. And so now Zelensky has kind of an issue on his hands. And that's really how I see it. That really, I mean, probably Trump all this time knew that Zelensky was not really exactly being that truthful on this matter, and now kind of
nor is he in control of $500 billion of minerals.
Absolutely. And so now kind of everything is kind of coming home to hit Zelensky, and it's a classic case of yesterday's Churchill is today's dictator. And hey, that's how it goes. And actually, who should learn from this? Nicole Pashinyan, because it shows you that with the United States, are they loyal to their people? I mean, in the end, I mean, are they gonna, I mean, they might, find Pashinyan useful, today, but tomorrow they'll throw him under the bus.
Yeah.
I wonder if he's watching this. I wonder if he understands this. He probably doesn't.
This is a classic case of not being at the table, but being on the menu. Right?
Absolutely.
And this is a huge country that's getting carved up, and Pashinyan is oblivious to it. In fact, they're still, what was it that I said? They are like dressed up and going to cocktail parties in the Orient Express while the driver has been thrown out over the bridge.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
I think the best advice anyone could give Zelensky tomorrow would be to stay in Washington, because I don't think that if he takes the outline of the deal, that, is going to be presented to him by Washington, that he's going to make it. He is the people who've been calling the shots in that country are, as we know, members of the far right who have very little use for Zelensky personally, and he's just not going to be able to survive it. So if he should stay in Washington, get a job at a think tank, and call it a day. I think that it's basically the clock is running on him.
Yeah, that's one of my biggest worries because no matter what is decided at the major superpower level, if there are these groups that now have weapons, they're in possession of weapons, and Arthur Martirosyan was talking about, okay, well, where does Russia stop if they don't reach a deal, if it doesn't get what it wants, and there is a huge risk that no one in Ukraine can negotiate a compromise deal with Russia because of this. So if Zelensky stays in Washington, someone else comes in his place, that person will also be assassinated, fortunately, because there are these neo-Nazi groups that are really influential in Ukraine, and it might turn into an insurgency, even if let's say the state implodes.
Well, I think the point about an insurgency is correct because what so few Americans have paid attention to is that all of this aid has turned Ukraine into an open air arms bazaar. And so even if and when there's a settlement in the East and Russia takes what it wants or whatever, Ukraine is going to become the most dangerous country in Europe by far because of all of the weapons that have been shipped in there. And so
it's going to become like an Eastern European Libya. It's going to become like an
yes,
Eastern European Libya, absolutely,
100%.
or Somalia. I mean, absolutely.
It's going to be like Kosovo. It's the Kosovo story all over again, right?
On a much bigger scale, yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be the center of human trafficking, of drugs, of weapons, illicit weapon shipments. It's a disaster in the making. There's no going back. And all of this, that country was turned into a rump state, a dangerous rump state, all over a promise that was never going to be fulfilled in the first place. So it's really terrible.
Yeah.
And Trump says that, the war wouldn't have started under his watch. I tend to believe it because I think he would have taken the Russian draft treaty that they issued in December of 2021 seriously. They wouldn't have just dismissed it. They wouldn't have signed the charter agreement with Ukraine that the Biden administration signed in November of 2021. So there are all these steps that American people aren't aware of. But, there were all these steps to February. And the biggest one was the rejection of that treaty.
And actually, one thing I also want to kind of add on that, James, is that there's a great historian, both James and I know, Jeff Roberts, who wrote a great, article, really, really good. I mean, like from a historian's point of view, called Now or Never, right? About the whole lead up to the Ukraine war, right? Which is constantly sold to, the Western, I mean, the Western media constantly sells it to Western audiences as being that this was a completely unprovoked war, which is the most disingenuous thing you can say, because if you look at what Jeff Roberts wrote, but reading Jeff Roberts' piece was like deja vu, because on this podcast specifically, on this Groong podcast, we had several episodes where I'm talking with Asbed and Hovik, and at the time I was in Yerevan, and we were saying almost every episode that I was on that, you know what, the US and the UK, they're provoking, and they better watch out because something's going to happen. And sure enough, we had an explosion in February 2022. So yeah, I mean, yeah.
So coming back to Gabbard, one of the things that really irks me with the intelligence community is how we have allowed ourselves as citizens to become, accepting of this pervasive, massive surveillance of citizenry. And in my heart, like I hope that Gabbard can chip away on that. But in fact, that was one of when I was reading a book, in high school called Privacy for Sale, which was actually what drove me to my future career choice of becoming a security and privacy expert. like I was like freaking out at the time at how much information was out there on people. And this is in the 1990s. So 30 years later, we have, all of like, hyper detailed collection of data on citizens in the US. Do you believe that Tulsi can do anything in regards to this and being able to, improve the privacy of the US citizens a little bit, coming back from Ukraine? Yes, let's put Ukraine to the side for a little bit.
No, not really. I'd be pretty pessimistic about that because there's no support for it among the oversight committees in Congress. And
Hmm.
she, of course, had to backtrack on her opposition to 702. So I'd be pretty pessimistic overall on that front.
Pietro, anything to add?
Yeah, I would say, unfortunately, I would be kind of pessimistic more or less on that too. Actually, again, you were talking about the 90s. Look at all the devices. Look at everything we have today. That a collection of data of people, of citizens, is actually, it's gotten much worse. I mean, Edward
Yeah,
Snowden can tell you that. Look at what the NSA does. So,
yeah.
yeah.
Okay, let's talk about another cabinet member and then we can continue something else. On the domestic front, it seems like the spotlight is on Elon Musk and all the Doge stuff, but on the foreign front, uh, you know, if I had to name two people like at the top of the list in terms of prominence, it would be Steve Witkoff and Keith Kellogg. I'm not sure if that's accurate. So I wanted to see like maybe if it's a incorrect perception. Where does Marco Rubio fit in? Where do all the other neocons fit in terms of the foreign policy agenda? And because at least on the Ukraine stuff, we're seeing a less hawkish approach than expected.
That's a great question, and I think there are two different species, if you will, of neocon. One is a true believer, and then the other is the pure opportunist or careerist. Trump, in his wisdom, has picked the second kind to staff his administration. So Marco Rubio has a long record of being a neocon, as does his national security advisor, Mike Waltz. Neither of them are going to do anything to jeopardize their seat at the table. I'm glad you brought off. You mentioned Kellogg. Kellogg is a
Yeah.
non-entity. He
Hmm.
doesn't matter. He's basically known as a doddering old fool here in Washington. He's totally irrelevant. Wyckoff, however, has emerged as kind of the surprise star of the whole show. And not only did he go to Israel and tell Netanyahu off, he was the only American official to have visited Gaza since the war. And then he went to Russia and met with Putin. And I mean, it seems to me that Trump's instincts in hiring this kind of, um, hard negotiating, hard charging um, businessman was actually a pretty good idea. I personally have been very impressed with Witkoff. I never expected to be impressed by Rubio or Walsh, but they basically, they're relatively young men, so they're not going to get crosswise with Trump or Vance, because Vance is going to be the next president, and they know this. So, I think that he picked the right if you can pick a right neocon, which is very debatable, and that would be a whole other podcast. But he's picked the right ones, from my perspective, because he picked the ones that are going to march to his tune.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. I mean, it's actually interesting to me because we're seeing them be so, I mean, no, I mean, reasonable. I mean, it's like a surprise. But a key element there that James mentioned is the fact that you don't have anybody who's like a dyed-in-the-wool ideological neocon in that administration. And we can see that, well, with Biden, there was somebody who I mean, there were several people of that strand in his administration. First and foremost, the Secretary of State,
Oh,
who's dyed in the wool.
don't
I know.
mention the
I don't
name,
even
please.
want. I'm not even going to mention his name. I'm just going to say the Secretary of State. Yeah, he was anonymous, but But yeah, absolutely. So that's actually they're surprisingly reasonable. I think that when actually one of the things that the Russians were saying, in particular about this meeting in Riyadh, I mean, they were just stunned. I mean, people here, I mean, are just stunned at what they're seeing, and they say that for the first time since 1992 or 1991, the Americans are actually listening to us. Like they can't believe it almost. You know, it's like pinch me. It's like a dream. And so they're actually being reasonable. And that's it's almost like again, it's like almost like a throwback to James Baker or George Shultz. I mean, when you look at it, I mean, it's remarkable, and it gives me hope. But we'll see what happens. Are they going to decouple? The thing is that they have to decouple, restoration of relations with Russia, um, with from the whole Ukraine peace plan, because one has to come before the other. They can't be rolled into the same package. The other thing they also have to think about is um, really. I lost my train of thought. James, you go, and you have something to add on this.
Well, I was just going to say, you bring up Schultz and Baker. The big difference, of course, is that when Reagan, Schultz, Baker, and HW were trying to work with the Russians, they didn't face accusations that they are secretly KGB and FSB informants. And that's what's going on in the United States. So, in the past couple of weeks, the media is trying to resurrect the Russia hoax playbook. And there were new stories about how, Trump is undoubtedly a covert agent of Russia and all this nonsense. And it's very unfortunate because it's poisoned a lot of people's minds. What Trump is doing, and when Trump says, Trump is the only president that I can remember actually standing in front of the cameras and saying, I think it's terrible that young people are being killed every day by the thousands. That should be a wholly unobjectionable sentiment. And yet, for his trouble, he's painted as a agent of the Kremlin for doing so. So the media is stuck in this 2016 kind of playbook. The American people don't buy it. And the evidence that they don't buy it is because 77 million Americans voted for him only last November. So, it's just what is discouraging is that, given all the objectionable things that he sometimes does, that this is an entirely good thing that he's doing to try to end the war, to try to actually speak to Putin. But as he pointed out the other day, Biden and Putin hadn't spoken in over 3 years. Well,
Which is remarkable for an American president.
remarkable.
Yeah, it's remarkable if you consider the whole history. I mean, like imagine Richard Nixon not talking to Brezhnev,
And
or
then
I
he
mean, just
pushed him up.
absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like crazy. But the other thing I wanted to say this too, that when I was observing this Riyadh meeting, and again, I mean, the reactions also I was getting here in Russia, that you really felt as if finally, because at least if there is some contact between Washington and Moscow, you know that there is a kind of a mechanism to avoid the worst, to avoid
Yeah,
nuclear
yeah.
confrontation.
Yeah.
And so,
That's the
what
point.
I'm saying about this is that, if like the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists had become less it became more politicized in recent years, as James can tell you, and but that's another story. But the bottom line is that this should have been a moment to turn the clock back from midnight. Because literally, if we had one more year of the Biden administration, or even if we had a Kamala Harris administration, we seriously would have been in grave danger of getting into a nuclear war. So thank God, I mean, that we have these Riyadh talks. That means that we're moving back from the abyss. We really are. Absolutely.
Because of time constraints, we always like to bring this around to how it is relevant to Armenia. In fact, as you mentioned, Biden, in the waning days of the Biden administration, Armenian Foreign Minister Mirzoyan signed a so-called strategic partnership agreement with the outgoing Secretary of State Blinken. Many observers wondered what the value of signing such an agreement was with an outgoing administration, but Mirzoyan has said that the incoming administration, the Trump administration, was aware of it and was on board. Now, this agreement was explicitly about not being a defense alliance. So, James, what does a US-Armenia strategic partnership provide for Armenia?
A target on its back. I mean, I think that it puts a target on Armenia's back. I think that it is going to be viewed by Russia and Iran as an invitation to invite their enemies into the region. I think it's a terrible idea. Pietro and I have spoken about this previously. I wholeheartedly agree with Pietro's views on Pashinyan. I think it's terrible. I doubt very seriously that the Trump administration knew anything about the agreement. I think it's a self-defeating move, and I don't understand why no one took a look at what happened in Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine over the past 10 years and thought, well, wait a second, this is not really a good move for us. But you have people who, they're operating on an outdated system, right? And time has passed these people by, these people who really still believe in the rules-based international order and that America is going to be your savior. We're not.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that the problem is, as I see it, I completely 100% agree with James. And I will just say this, the problem is Pashinyan is apparently the only way I mean, besides him being an agent, this is my other talking point, or being a traitor, that's the other talking point. But I also think he is a student of Francis Fukuyama in a period where Fukuyama has never been less relevant. He's no longer relevant anymore. That whole idea of the end of history, that's gone, right? But he has not realized that yet. So he's still thinking, we can get there, get involved with the United States, become part of the unipolar moment, as if we're partying like it's 1998 here, man. And unfortunately, it's not for Pashinyan. That's not where the world is right now. But he still keeps swimming against the current. He still believes that somehow we'll snap back into that moment. Maybe this is just a nightmare of mine or something like that. But it's not going to. And actually, you know what? He should have gotten that not only by looking at the past examples of, let's say Mikhail Saakashvili, or I don't know, look how Ukraine has been, look how these other former Soviet, leaders have been, these other leaders in Ukraine, let's say, in the past have been treated, like Yushchenko or Poroshenko. But also, it's about what's happening right now, what's unfolding right in front of his eyes. So he's seeing the way Zelensky is being treated, and it doesn't faze him, right?
It doesn't faze him, absolutely.
He goes to Washington, D.C., Trump has no time for him. He doesn't pay attention to him. The best that Pashinyan can get is an unofficial meeting with J.D. Vance.
A photo op.
A photo op. That's all. There wasn't even the Armenian flag there. It was just the U.S. flag. No, so that means it wasn't even an official reception.
What's funny that you just mentioned Francis Fukuyama, and this is the second show that we are recording today, Hovik and I, and he came up in both shows.
Well, absolutely. But I couldn't believe it. I was a few years, many years ago, I was a master's student at the University of Michigan, and I came across his book on the shelf, and I just couldn't believe the end of history.
Yeah.
Like, what a crazy idea, But the bottom line is there are still people who believe this.
Yeah.
And Pashinyan is stuck in that time warp. He still believes that this is the rules-based order, the unipolar American moment, and he's still swimming against the stream. And he's jeopardizing the security of his own country. And really, and when he goes so far as to deny the genocide of his own people, when he goes so far as to betray the people of Artsakh, we can go on and on and on about all this.
Yeah.
But
now, James, I absolutely heard what you said, but I'm going to push it a little bit more. The Iran-Israel conflict, which of course pulls the U.S. into the conflict as well, is a clear and present danger to Armenia's national security. Also, the fact that the U.S. pretty much can't project power into the South Caucasus without Turkey is a major concern for Armenia. This whole thing, compounding this with the continuing expansionist dictatorship in Azerbaijan, which is maximally supported by Turkey, Armenia has problems at its doorstep. Can the US-Armenia agreement become any kind of a commitment to the US to hold Armenia harmless while the US tries to manage these various conflicts and relationships in the region according to its interests. And part two of that question is, what are the U.S. national interests in the South Caucasus region, especially in light of this potential strategic reassessment of its relationship with Russia?
For the United States, it all revolves around Iran. And unfortunately, for Armenia, the problem is that in Washington, the Israelis basically call the shots in the area. And as you know all too well, the Israelis are in bed with Azerbaijan. And I just find it very hard to believe that the US is going to do anything to help Armenia out because of the energy issue for one, but also because of the Israel issue. And as long as Azerbaijan allows Israel to use it as a jumping off point to do whatever they do inside Iran, it's going to be very hard to convince policymakers in the Trump administration to act. So the real security guarantors for Armenia are Russia and Iran. There's no getting around it. You have, and unfortunately, again, and I'm someone who is one of the few Americans who have been advocating for the United States to scrap NATO for years. We're tied to Turkey through NATO. So, it's a tough situation. Why would you think that the United States would be a good guarantor of your security when, we're already in an alliance with Turkey, right? To me, it seems nonsensical for any Armenian administration to have done that. But that's where we are.
All right. I guess we're just going to leave it there for today. Thank you, gentlemen, James, Pietro, for joining us. We appreciate the time you've spent with us today.
Thank you, Asbed.
Thank you,
it's been wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Pleasure to be here.
Great discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's our show today. The episode was recorded on February 27, 2025. We've been talking with James Carden, who is a former advisor to the U.S.-Russia Bilateral Presidential Commission at the State Department. His columns have appeared in many national and international newspapers and magazines.
We also had Dr. Pietro Shakarian, who is a historian of Russia and the Soviet Union and a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Historical Research at the National Research University Higher School of Economics in St. Petersburg, Russia. He is currently completing his book on the role of Anastas Mikoyan in Soviet nationality policy reform and de-Stalinization during the era of Nikita Khrushchev's thaw. For more information on all the participants in this episode, check out our show notes at podcasts.groong.org/episode number.
It's good to have you with us. Thank you for staying with us. It's been a great show. I'm Asbed Bedrossian in Los Angeles.
And I'm Hovik Manucharyan in Yerevan.
We'll talk to you very soon. Bye-bye.